Oh, sailor, have you found your perfect sea?
I want to talk about time. There's many reasons I want to talk about it, not least being that because of the way most of us think about time most of the time, it's like something that's not really there. We just take it for granted. It's just we act chronologically, and so we do things within time, and that can easily lead us to think that, well, time is just a ticking of a clock or moments of transition, and then there's mechanical time, a sequence of tick, 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 tick. We can measure it out. It's something measurable. It's a backdrop for understanding spatial objects. So if we think about how time in philosophy generally, up until at least Martin Heidegger and Henri Bergson, I don't want to go too far into their philosophies, but I will say a little bit about them. But it was just generally assumed that when one was talking about time, one was just talking about, the sequence of events that happened. And if we think of time, as I said, as a backdrop to mechanical processes, if we take the philosophy of Immanuel Kant, for example, he takes time as the precondition of their being and their fundamental operation of what he calls the transcendental operation. Again, I don't want to go too far into that. It's just he's making the point that any representations we have are required to be in time. So he talks about us. When we have knowledge of things, we have to have intuitions of things. And by an intuition, he doesn't mean a hunch. He means something that you view. He's using the Latin idea of intuit, not what we normally have with, the synonym we normally have as feeling, but something that is a presence. And that is a presence that we can only know it's a presence if it's in time and if it's in space. So that's his argument. Well, that's all well and good, and that's the kind of thing that's awfully helpful if you want to sit down and do experiments about balls rolling down inclined planes or projectiles or anything where physics is involved. Some concept of time is going to be important, and then time and its relationship to space. Now, people like Bergson and to some extent one might make the point about Hegel, but I don't want to go there. But Heidegger, who's the more well-known, bring time. Bergson's mainly forgotten now, but Heidegger, especially his book Being and Time, was a book that changed the whole nature in many ways of philosophy, and in many ways I'd say is possibly the most important of 20th century philosophers. Certainly one that's had a huge impact even upon the post-structuralists. Not so much obviously analytic philosophy, but as you can see, I'm no analytic philosopher. In the book I wrote, I did a pretty heavy critique of what I think is wrong with analytic philosophy. So anyway, Heidegger's point about time is really about how we act within time and about the projects that we undertake and how involvement in time. So time becomes an ontological feature of our existence, not just a mechanical feature, not just in the case of Kant, as I said, it's a condition of cognitive capacity of things being in time. We have the capacity, but the thing being in time is the operation which is required to confirm that capacity is doing anything of any value. So Heidegger's moved it away from that, and he's wanting to set out a general ontology of what he calls Dasein, literally translated. It's often translated as just existence, but literally translated, it's the there being, or to be there, to be there, a there being, which we are. That's his fundamental basis of talking about. He doesn't even want to talk about the human being because he believes that the human brings with it. I was just recently involved in some podcast where this guy was deferring to this trajectory, this tradition. I could see he was clearly thinking about Michel Foucault and these French post-structuralists that all take up this point about Heidegger, and they say that we're anti-humanist because the human is already a fabrication of the way in which expectations coming from a particular time and place are foisted onto the world, so we limit the world. And that comes out of the Heideggerian point, that when he's saying, no, we don't want to talk about the human as such, because that's already, as I said, that's already to put it in a package where there's a distortion that comes from metaphysical assumption. And Heidegger said, I'm the guy that's going to smash that all to bits. We're going to reconstruct everything from the ground up. By the way, this idea of starting all over again from the ground up, this is such a conceit of philosophy. It really drives me crazy. Heidegger's teacher, Husserl, who again I write a chapter on that in my book on Idolizing the Idea, he said Descartes, this is Husserl now, Descartes wanted to start everything from the cogito, from the I think, from the founding, recognizing that starting simply from the world itself is to enter into a morass of confusion. And then Husserl, in his, well, he does it a number of places, but the place you might want to look, it's called the Cartesian Meditations. And he says the problem with that is he too is making all these assumptions. And if you go off and want to follow Heidegger's lectures on the history of metaphysics, they're not all in one spot, but he talks about them lots and lots of places. They're fantastic lectures and books that he's written on this. And he takes up this aspect of Husserl, although he's also very critical of what Husserl does, and he's critical of it for good reasons. But having said all that, I think the way Heidegger talks about time does draw out certain things I think are valuable. Yes, there's projects. Yes, there's a moment in which there is action. But I want to add a few things, and I also don't want to talk about time in the way that Heidegger does, insofar as he draws you into a whole way of talking about ontology, in which it's like pieces of a puzzle, which you've got to have this bit and then this bit and then that bit. And as you may have picked up from the lectures, one of the problems I have with people using philosophy the way they do is that they think the task is that if they could position you, and this goes right back to what I think Plato is doing, and I'd put Heidegger in exactly in this tradition. There's a part in Plato, and I may have mentioned this before, where he talks about Apollo occupying a place, a vantage point, from which you can see everything, from which he could see everything. And I think the hope of philosophical rulership, if we did things more in a philosophical way, would be better off. And to some extent, I'm suggesting that philosophy can be very helpful. So you might say, I'm guilty of this too, except the thing I would say is, yes, but we've got to, as far as I'm concerned, philosophy is just able to clear up a bit of the mess. It doesn't really have any answers. And I will eventually do a lecture on what to do, because I'm sure some people, if anyone's watching this, are going to say at one point, that's all very well, but what do we do? To cut to the chase, that is not going to be my job, but I think we can talk about some aspects of that by being aware of what not to do. And if we don't do some things, our doing, which will be the doing that the moment requires in the doing with the capacities we have for the doing, may well be better, instead of repeating these age-old mistakes, many of which I think go back to philosophy. So that's a very long prelude into the fact that I want to talk about time, and I want to say 4 things about time. And I'm not, I'm very tempted to say there's 4 dimensions of time. I'll just say there may well be other ways in which we can think of time. And by the way, I'll just say something before I get into these 4 things. You'll note in our grammar, and it's to Rosenstock-Huessy, one of my favourite thinkers, I've mentioned him many times, I think he is very good at drawing attention to the fact that what is happening when we speak is that as we use tenses reflecting upon time, past, present, future tense, then subjunctive tense, past, future. There's all these combinations of the different tenses. The grammatical moods indicate the way in which we are able to make sense of our experiences, pass them on to get us to think about our experiences. And some of those things, though, can be very, very misleading, very beguiling. And indeed, one of the things that this is a corrective, this talk today is meant to be a corrective, is, one of the things about the subjunctive mood, would it were the case, and it's so easy to go from would it were the case to I know what would be the case if blah blah and all these hypotheticals, and then you get into the position where you think I can redesign the world with my thinking. And that is a kind of grammatical piece of beguilement combined with a certain kind of conceit about intelligence and how it operates in the world, and a failure to understand the sheer complexity, something I've drawn attention to time and time again, of us all constantly doing things at any given moment. So the world is not a there. It's no there. It's a constant process. It's a constant flux of activity that involves us. And those aspects of it, the there-ness of it in the aspects of it, which we can try and pin down by identifying laws, that's fine, but they only work because we filter out the flux in order for us to grasp certain constancies that we think are helpful. Now, that's very good. I'm not being a relativist and saying, oh no, that's all, there's no such things as laws. I'm not saying that at all. But I'm saying within that, the content of our lives, there's so much flux, there's content of social lives especially, of human lives, there's so much flux that the emphasis upon the constant it can be very, very lead us into terrible dead ends. And one of the things that I notice, and why I'm giving these lectures, is because there's certain assumptions are constantly being made when people are making statements. And the stuff when I was talking about rights, I think was a very good example of that. People just assuming that if they, or demanding that if they appeal to a right, that's problem solved. Instead of, no, it's not problem solved at all. It's just a particular appeal you're making, and you're generating a whole other set of problems, and the outcomes of which are going to be all these responsive reactions to it by people that don't think like you, which is the problem with any philosophical point of view, any point of view which thinks that finding a philosophy in which we can all stand together and look in the same direction and then act on the basis of that looking is quite simply crazy. At the same time, and one reason I think religions have been far more successful at social binding is because in the main, you might say they're sloppier, they're looser, they're tapping in to something at a more existential, visceral level, which they appeal to, and the way they appeal to it, of course, is not just through a set of abstractions, even though they may come in when the theologians get to work, but through a set of stories. And it's the story and the way in which a story plus a ritual and a rite and then a public are formed, and the potency of the story can be identified by the public that forms around it. This is again a great mistake of people, is to think that religion is a small group of people having control over everybody. Well, in the first instance, what you've got to think of is the appeal that story had to people, the mass appeal. If it doesn't have that, it's never going to fly. Whichever religion you look at, it must have that. And they're not a philosophy. They're a story. But they are stories in time. Which brings me now to the four things I want to say about time. First, So, 1. Time passed. Time passed as living and informative. Hang on to that. The time passed as living and informative really matters. I'm going to come back to each one of these and go into them in depth. 2. The time when an action is taken. The time when it is taken. That really matters. The same action at a different time can mean something completely different. It can even mean the complete opposite of it. And again, this tends to be a mistake that even quite sensible people make when they say stupid statements comparing different figures. One of the famous one that just drove me nuts was people comparing Trump to Hitler. I didn't care, if you want to criticise Trump, anyone wants to, fine, but comparing him to Hitler, please give me a break. And and one of the problems is they just think a Hitler is someone you call anybody, or now Putin is Hitler. This is just garbage. And partly it's garbage because they fail to understand that a guy like Hitler could have power because of the time and the kinds of people that were generated out of the events of that time. And time and events have to be considered to be... Social time and events are so close to each other, they're almost inseparable. That's something I'll speak about a little more. So the time of action is done. The third point is the time that is taken to do an action. Now that, again, is extremely underestimated by intellectuals, and it drives me absolutely crazy. And at the basis of it is this entire conceit of our intellectuals that all they have to do is identify something as wrong and it'll be fixed. It just needs, crayons and butcher's papers and a bit of time to do get hold of the institutions. Then we'll all be doing it. And a complete failure to think about what kind of actions require what kind of cultivations require what kind of time to bring about a certain end, and then that's not even considering what kinds of resistances, what kind of flaws, what kind of chaotic aspects that we had not even remotely entertained come into play, which undo any plan that we may have. So any idea about cultivation in time still requires assuming that certain things which you don't even know about won't happen. So that is a problem. And finally, aspect of time I want to talk about. I'm not saying there aren't other aspects of time that are important, but I think these 4 are particularly important. And that is the time that is required to see the significance of something. And again, this I think is wildly underestimated. So, let's go back. Time passed as living and informative. Let's talk about that. So, what I mean by this is that any of us in any situation, in fact, everywhere you look, you see works in time. Look at this room. I don't know what is coming on the camera, but I'm looking at this room, or your room, and everywhere you look, you say, oh, this was made at one time. This was made and sold. And a whole sort of human operations occurred in time to make and produce anything that you can see here. So the entire built-up world that surrounds you, the world of objects that we have, produced objects, but even grown objects, even just the time taken for an apple to grow, or tree to grow, or grow. You go to the shop, everything, everywhere you are seeing products of time. Now, you might think, well, that's obvious, yeah, that's so what? Now, here's a thing that is related to this. It's not the main point I want to make this, but it is something that is worth mentioning. And that is, and this explains the tendency, which I think is such, the conceit of intellectuals, which this whole series of intellectuals is a series of talks is meant to help you steel yourself up in resistance to these conceits and to this class of the conceited, is that all of us live our lives in time, but when we reflect, which all thinking is a kind of reflection, when we reflect, we do so episodically, not sequentially. So if for example, I don't know if I've used this example before, but I'll use it. When people usually read a biography on someone, the typical biographer, and this is one of the problems I have with most writers of biography, and with most biographies thus, is that they will, the parents, the grandparents, they were blah, blah, blah. They lived here, they moved there, they did this, they did that. But, their lives didn't matter much, so they get 2 pages. This is supposed to be telling you about person X, whether it's, pick your person, Stalin, Hitler, Joe Blow down the road, anyone, your pop singer you want. This is the biographer, typical biographer's way of doing it. Chronologically, you see. So then the parents are born and they did this and this, and then they raised little Johnny, and little Johnny or Mary or whatever, they went to the primary school and the teacher had a big effect and blah, 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 blah. And next thing you know, and now they're going to conquer the world because of this and this. And you think, hang on a minute, God, I've had experiences like, little Mary or little Adolf did at school, but hell, I didn't end up like this. So what are the things that really matter? And that's, if you think, now, so that's a typical biography. And of course the biographer will eventually get to the events that mattered. But in a sense, just replicating that chronology, it's just, who cares? It's like, okay, it's something you're doing. You feel it is your duty as a biographer to go and replicate. You're going to discover that. And, the shopping list that he took, little Freddie Nietzsche took the shop. I'm thinking of Derrida. Once did a whole little book on, I think it's a scrap of paper of Nietzsche's talking. Is it I forgot my umbrella, or I must have got my umbrella, something like this, a long time ago. But, he was making the point about insignificant scraps, and perhaps they meant something. And anyway, my point here is that in a life, if I am to tell you about my life, or you tell me about your life, it's going to be the major episodes that matter. Not, you don't start off and say, well, Granddad came from Ireland and, Grandma came from China and they met in the shop and then blah, 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 blah. No, we're going to go straight to the events. And that's because we think episodically. That's the episodes of not only a life, but of social life, of aspects of, and that's how we also think generally when we think historically. When we think, we're always moving through associations. And the question is, how do we gather those associations, and which associations is it worth listening to, focusing upon, paying attention to, and the associations that person X has made, does someone else, are they able to connect with that? And of course, because when we're trying to make sense of things, it's the big events that are the basic storehouse. It's not storehouse, the source of the associations which are meaningful to us. So in these lectures, a number of times I've done this. I mean, everybody does this, but I've talked about the French Revolution or the Russian Revolution, because I want to draw attention to the fact that at a point in time back then, at a particular point in time, a whole set of activities happened which hugely changed the way in which people were doing things that had an impact upon subsequent generation, and which goes some way to explaining why we still prioritise the things that we prioritise, have the values or the institutions that we do, or the processes we do. So these kind of things matter. And so when we're talking about events, we're talking about these often collision, we might say a collision of all these actions that are taking place. But something of such fundamental importance comes out that we belatedly, or at some point even the actors within the event, belatedly realise all these things are connected, and they give it a name. And usually the name comes in a social event when it's something pretty serious has happened. So at some point in France, at some point, and who knows exactly what day it was, people started talking in France and outside of France of there being a revolution. Now, all these things that were happening from the financial crisis that feeds into it, from the class conflict that is occurring, from the aspirations of professional classes, from the philosophers writing their stuff, from people in the salons talking, from the famine that's going on, and then the Great Fear, all the various events that you can read about. Whenever you read a book on the French Revolution, you'll tend to see certain events being stressed, even though a historian might come along with some new explanation to say this was really the thing that mattered that others, haven't really noticed. And of course that's the job. That's the job of the historian. You can take it or leave it, and then get in line, and then everyone thinks that's great, and then 20 years later someone else comes along and says, no, that's bollocks, it was this. And then 20 years later. So the event, which actually feeds into what I'm saying, to see its significance as time goes on, we keep changing what things we think are most significant. And certainly the professions do that, and not surprisingly, events come with their own mythology. And we don't even realise often after a while that they're a kind of mythological. So much of what people think about the modern world, so when they're calling about Hitler and Trump, they're basically referring now to a mythology about Nazism, and they're getting all their mythologies about it from the films and everything. Some people who really know the period, they can talk with authority about what happened, but most people, they don't know that much about it, certainly, and even less about what happened under the communists or what happened under the French Revolution. But there tends to be, even quite educated people, I've noticed, they have a few associations about major historical events, and they will trot them out. The Renaissance means this, the Reformation means that. They don't have had to go into a lot of depth. Now, as I'm talking now about time past and events, I'm really talking about the associations we have. So that is one aspect. So one aspect about time past is every generation, for a number of reasons, but basically it has to do with the pedagogy of the time, the priorities of the time, of the educators of that time, the consensus of the form, the stuff that they then pick up and pass on to subsequent generations. And as people have to live a life and don't spend all their time reading, and as the people who read don't really agree on much, because the flood of associations are so vast that people are going to naturally emphasise different things. We can see that the past information that we are conscious of is one thing, and we can break that down into two types, or we can say two things about that, and that is there's certain consensuses form about it. Those consensuses tend to really change over time. That is, in a period of 50 years, as the event recedes more and more further back, and as the mythological threads and strands, the stories told about it, ever start to evaporate, people either move from not having very much understanding of it to a simple formula about what occurred. So there's a kind of lack of memory of the general public, and the other thing that it almost goes in pairs. They're symmetrically related in some way. And the other thing that happens is the scholarship starts to get ever more, in a sense, advanced. There's more sources. The scholars themselves inevitably are going to be caught up in the value expectations and priorities that are part and parcel of that society, and hence part and parcel of their actually being paid. They're able to have a job because the institutions service the requirements of the professional class or the different class requirements, and you tend to have to think a certain way, but then within that there will be more ever increasing diversity, arguments between scholars, revisionist history. There's a new book coming out by a guy called Peter Heather. I kind of like Peter Heather, and it's about how Christianity triumphed. And I watched a lecture he gave about how, and he was making the point in this lecture, and I gather he's going to make it in the book, that all these other scholars have neglected the fact that the Roman elite conversion was a pivotal point. And I think that's really interesting. Here we are, 2,000 years later, and here's some guy going, now they all got it wrong except me, and they missed this one point. And I think, I don't think so. I'm just really sceptical of that. I think he's got a point that certain scholars underestimate that, but to think that once you've got that locked into your head, everything else you can dispense with. And I'm not saying he's doing that, but it just happens all the time. When someone makes a career, it doesn't matter what the topic is, pretty well everyone got that wrong. No one really understood the French Revolution except me, or the Russian Revolution except me. So that's one thing. So on the one hand, you've got so much knowledge that the specialists are saying, hang on, I'm the only one that's got this. And on the other hand, everybody else is like, blah, 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 blah. That's it, most people who don't know anything about the history of the church will go, yes, it was ruled by a pope, and no, it's all just terrible. They just duped everybody and they bossed everybody around. And if you say, hang on a minute, what about the difference between the church in Antioch or in Alexandria and the conflicts that are going on? They're going, hey, what are you talking about? I even remember an educated friend of mine, I really like him, but there's no academics. They just feel us in terms of being able to say things that expose their ignorance. They think they aren't. When he was talking about how Thomas Munster. So this is we're talking 16th century here, and Thomas. I don't want to go into that, but Thomas Munster, if you look in the Anabaptists, it was a very violent period of time in German history, and he was equating that with what was happening in Christianity 1,500 years ago, because he said, why don't we just focus upon this? And I thought, hang on, why would you focus upon that? Because that's a 16th century phenomenon. And at one point, I in the discussion, I mentioned Augustine. He said, Augustine, what's that, about 1,000? About 1,000 AD, or common era? And he was out, 600 years or so. And I thought, these vast periods, see, time. So over time, as we get remote from it, as the living has gone into a curtain, a veil, and as our understanding is working with episodes and consensuses, our understanding is going to be all over the shop. We require specialists to tell us. And it's just one example after another. All of a sudden, something that no one thought about. I'll just give you another one. After 9/11, a big story came out. This is the Muslims remembering the Crusades. People were saying this. You go, hang on a minute. How many Muslims were thinking about the Crusades? And then Bin Laden thought, that's a good idea, we'll say that. But no Muslims were thinking about the Crusades, until something like this happens, and it's it's used as kind of justification. We should, and you think, this is just fantastical stuff. So, now there's two aspects about this. So I'm talking about so far the way in which time passed as it was lived, and the information that we have about it, it's receded, and on one lot we have a great mass of people have these little ticky-tack bits, it wouldn't even fit on the back of a Kellogg's cornflake pack, or in the card you have in the Kellogg's cornflake pack. And then you've got the historians, and then you've got all these other academics in between who are more educated than the rest, but not specialists, but they've read something in the paper, or they've picked up a book, and they're very good at saying why they think what they think, because that's what they get paid to do that, and people listen to them, and they're very articulate, but it doesn't mean they know very much. So this is kind of blind leading the blind, and there's nothing more complicated than the past in terms of our knowing it. But then there's another bit which is every bit as important, and this is the kind of thing that many conservative thinkers point to, and which is why in the main, I've said before, I do not think I'm a conservative thinker, and the reason I don't is because any given moment the question is, what do we do? And there's past traditions, if they're working, and in the West they're pretty well all destroyed anyway, and there's the future, which means a complete break, and different times there's this rupture, and I think we've reached a point of no return personally, but I could be wrong. I hope I'm wrong. But at different times, people leap into the future. They attack their institutions, and in part that's also because the West has been caught up in revolutionary traditions for a long time. So the gates of its traditions keep getting smashed, and more bits get smashed. So that's true. But what the better conservative thinkers, like people like Michael Oakeshott, a 20th century thinker, or Edmund Burke. I don't want to say someone like Burke, I agree with everything he says or anything like that, but in some ways I think Hegel is quite a conservative thinker. It's more complicated, and I don't want to get caught too much up in the philosophy, or another one, very interesting guy, Joseph de Maistre, is really a reactionary thinker. But what they recognise is the way in which tacit features, that is, features of social life which are just taken for granted, which are often called prejudices, and Burke, interestingly, says a prejudice is... he was writing at the time in the Enlightenment saying, look, get rid of everything, of the past is just a prejudice. Burke said, no. Prejudices are the reasons that have become ensconced in our habits, and they even now seem like a second instinct to us. They have their reasons. They've been cultivated over time. Now, I think this is a very good point to make, and I'd be very reluctant I think we're very foolish, I should say, if we think that not to take into account deeply held sentiments and why they've been deeply held and widely held across cultures and across times, they should be looked at as more than just mere idiotic prejudices. If they're prejudices in the Burkean sense, that means they're ways of acting in the world which have worked up to a certain point for a certain group of people and been beneficial for a large number of people. It doesn't mean they weren't. It does not mean they were not that they were beneficial for everybody. And this is a serious problem we face in the modern world, because it is very commonplace now for people to speak on behalf of groups who have been if you like, victims of prejudice. But the question is, what kind of world is replacing that older world, and is it a better world or is it a worse world? And that's a serious one, because the people doing the full frontal attack on this are assuming they're making a better world. Their critics, and I am a critic of this, think no. Trying to get some balance, yes, but certainly just full-on disrespect, negating. When I say disrespect, not even bothering to think of why that world was the way that world was, why those prejudices occurred, what were the opportunity costs of dismantling those prejudices, what's going to happen now as these are, serious people think seriously, and once upon a time, I think for all the flaws of the educated classes, it was more serious. I just don't think it's very serious now. Of course, there were places where maybe it wasn't that serious. When you had people becoming Stalinists, and you had them becoming Nazis, there was already what Julian Bender in a famous book called The Betrayal of the Clerks. Betrayal of the Clerks, yeah. Anyway, Julian Bender, Betrayal of the Clerks. Anyway, that can be looked up. Oh, God, I'm going to have to cut that. The treason of the clerks, that's what it is, the treason of the clerks. And that he was pointing out that, here are these people whose we entrust as society, in a sense, to be the brains trust, and they've completely lost their mind. They've completely sold out. And I think this has happened periodically, and it's happened again, but it hasn't always happened. Though the danger is the more we've come dependent upon ideas, something I pointed out in another lecture, the more fragile we are, because the errors, of which there will always be errors, become amplified and can do great danger. So, the point of me talking about Burke and about what he said about prejudice is this. In the first instance, I said time passes living and informative, tends to become more abstract, our understanding, our associations thinner and thinner and thinner, and then we have the specialists, they get thinner and thinner and thinner as they all fight it out amongst themselves, and then someone has a hit book, and that's that thing. But then there is simply the reality that we're living in, which is all around us, but we don't think about. It is all around us. I gave the example of all the objects in the room. But the other way it's around us genetically, and genes matter up to a point for certain things. A very good friend of mine, we usually have dinner once a week. He's an evolutionary biologist. He thinks they matter in ways I'm not sure that they do. But as a part and parcel of certain things that we can do, they're certainly going to be there. Our capacity to sing, jump, the size of our nose, the shape of our body, all these things, genes play a part, but that's one aspect. But more importantly is the rhythms, the social rhythms, the social sentiments, the habits of the character of nations. I may have mentioned this in my talk about character, that it's a great pity that people have not given enough attention to the character of nations, because if they did give more, and there's Angelo Codevilla wrote a good book on this, and Eugen Rosenstock-Huessy wrote another book in German on the character of European nations and their revolutions. That's important, because if you think about different characters of nations, like different characters, not everyone's going to get on. Everybody knows that they might have 2 or 3 different friends. You never want to put them together; they're not going to get on. But when it comes to people living together, the idea that you can this was a terrible mistake of multiculturalism. It was a conceit. It was just a conceit that everyone come in and everything would everyone get on happily together. And Roy Hattersley, the British Labour politician, when the burning of Salman Rushdie's book, Satanic Verses, occurred, and all the riots were, He couldn't believe it. He said, I never thought that multiculturalism could lead to this. And I think, well, you idiot. Why wouldn't it? Why do you expect people with a whole other different set of priorities, values, whether they're better or worse or whatever, it doesn't matter. Why would you expect in large numbers they would simply say, yes, you can do whatever you like, and we're not going to be offended or upset by that? Of course they're going to be. So if you're doing multiculturalism, you've got to do it in a serious way. But it's not a serious way if all you do is piss off one group of people at the expense of another. And if you piss off the local inhabitants, which is what we've been seeing for a very long time, and it's what we saw in Brexit, it's what we saw with the various populist parties. And I can't bear the way the intellectuals just go, oh well, they just need to, they just should think like us. They don't live like you. Why would they think like you? They're not you. But you, as a member of the ruling class, should remember that all rulership is symbiotic. If you don't understand the fundamentals of symbiosis as the basis, I mentioned this when I talked about social formations. If you don't understand that, you're not seeing anything. Okay, bringing this back to time past as living and informative. A way in which, so I've talked very generally about, everybody in the Western world, is here because of all these processes. You don't know them, but they made you who you are. You can take a moral value judgment and talk about how shocking it was that in the United States, so many hundreds of thousands, 500,000, I'm not sure the exact numbers, of Native Americans were either killed in long marches, moved out of territories, dispossessed, broken contracts. Yes, that's true. That is true. Was it shocking? Absolutely. But if you think that by you denouncing people of today because of that, in some way makes you less of a beneficiary of all the things that came out of this massive land grab, the big railways moving to west, the opening up of what ultimately would open up, tremendous wealth for all those people in North America, for the whole country, because it's such a wealthy country. Whether you say stuff about it or you don't say stuff, it doesn't matter. We're born into it. And this is true with us in Australia. Here is a place that, yes, there are indigenous people. How the colonialists came in, some people want to say there was a huge number of frontier wars. I don't think there was taking of land. There were people killed. I'm not even going to put any kind of moral spin on it because it was what it was. People suffered. Yes. That cannot be, but my point is, because you're sitting around at a dinner party in Sydney drinking a Chardonnay and watching the ABC or the TV and thinking that you are really a much better person because you identify with those people that suffered more in some way than someone who doesn't talk about it or think about it, I'm sorry, it's bullshit. It's just rubbish. Everybody, to everybody, where the sins of the father are visited to you. This is why I like religious language sometimes, but everybody is implicated in that, and it can't be undone. That's the point. What you do now will be a new thing. You may do something that may be a motivation, but to simply go around and berate people because they're white or they're wealthy, or this is just, and of course you can see most of the people doing the berating are fairly wealthy. It's just a con job. But I'm expressing my moral revulsion at it. I just want to make another point at a level of insight and oversight. It's just thoughtless. It's simply thoughtless. And people shouldn't take seriously thoughtless chatter. and our age there's so much thoughtless chatter, and the thoughtless chatter is someone who thinks that all past time did not contribute into what they are, so all the blood and guts and gore of what happened. So you don't have to tell a triumphalist story, but they're telling they all did it, they are all criminals and sinners, but somehow I'm not because I recognise the they. No, it's not true. You and everybody else, everybody is living on the blood, the bones, the conquests, the suffering, the triumphs, the good, the bad, the ugly of the past. And if you're interested in finding out about that past, then do so. Now, that's another aspect of this same thing. Time past is living and informative. You are alive in it. There's no way of being around that. You can't undo it. You can't undo the fact that I'm listening to a fantastic lecture series by Sean Gabb about the history of England. And there's anyone who wants to go back and look at the history of England, you see tribe upon tribe coming in and taking over that island, taking over the island. And at some point, so when the Queen died, I noticed I read all this stuff about the British Empire and blah, 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 and I've just written a piece in the Postal where I argue against these people because I just think it's blather, nonsense, thoughtlessness, very morally presented, but it's just rubbish. And it's simply because wherever you go, conquest, murder, mayhem, that's what we're born into. That's why I want to talk about evil, possibly in the next lecture. There's no escaping it. It's how we're able to face up to it, how we live with it, what we do with it, in a sense how we redeem it. That's the thing. But not pretending that we are so pure, or like those stupid people, when Black Lives Matter was happening 2 years ago, all these white people finding any black person they could to supplicate themselves. I'm so good. Everybody knew. Every black person with a quarter of a brain could see what a mob of idiots are doing this. Some, of course, played along with it. Oh, this is great. Yeah, but as I've said before, if you want to do something, give them your house, your car, your wallet, and go away. Kill yourself. If that's really what you think your answer is, do it. Do us all a favour. I don't really mean that in case I get banned from YouTube, which for my 10 listeners or so. Okay. So now there's another aspect to the same thing about living, and that is lived time accrues. So it's not only that we're living the way we do because of everything that's happened in the past. It's all. I remember when I was a kid, these science fiction stories about someone would go back in the past, I'm sure you've read it, and they change one thing and then the whole history of humankind is like the butterfly effect. And I think there's a lot in that. These little things that really matter a lot and we don't see. But we are all here because of everything that's happened, the way it's happened. But the fact, whether we think of it or not, is irrelevant to that. I think that insofar as we are a society in which thought really matters, that it is better to be more thoughtful because our thoughtlessness does all sorts of damage to us. And one of the things it's doing is creating this kind of divisiveness in which you've got these moral Puritans who are exactly the same beneficiaries as everybody else of the plunder and hurt of the past, are speaking as if they're not. And that is different from acting today upon ways and means of which make a better world. But none of the stuff they're talking about is a better ways and means, and I'll talk about that later too. But living time in the pressure of a time, the heat of the time, and the emotions in circulation at a time, this is really something, and this concerns us as well. And it just as in pretty well every eventful period that is either revolutionary or violent and explosive in some ways, there is the pressure of the moment, the pressure of the time. And I think there's a kind of general hysteria, kind of things where you keep reading things and you think, wow, can this be happening? I can't believe this is happening. And one more thing leads you to open your jaw even wider, thinking, can you believe this is now happening? That's happened. And our time is one of endlessly doing that. And it's been like this for a while, but it's certainly in my lifetime. In the last few years, it's just things that were like that, because it has it's a big block of time in which it's been occurring, and an arc of events that goes right back to the 1960s. And the 1960s can only be explained by what happened of the Great Generation and the World Wars, etc. That's the way, again. So it's this, in a sense, time thrusting, social time, the events thrusting, impacting upon us, and the greater excitement, tensions, divisiveness, the panic, as I said, heat, the temperature of the time. I think everybody knows what I'm talking about. There's a kind of thing that, again, it tends to get taken for granted without ever being really thought about. And as you can see, even the way I'm thinking about it, it's one of those aspects of existence where it doesn't easily lend itself to a luminous set of conceptual classifiers to explain it, yet I think everybody knows exactly what I'm talking about. And it's because of the pressure and the heat of a time that their pathways, which may have been opened in the past, have closed. Actually, that's now. We're in a now period where, take a guy like Jordan Peterson, for example. This, to me, is a very good indicator. The amount of hate that's put on him is, I don't mind someone saying, he's just a psychologist and it's a little banal or blah, blah, blah. The general things he says, okay, fair enough, if you want to say that. But the hatred that he got, that was really interesting. And the support that he got, that's also interesting. Who's supporting him and who's hating him? And my thought was always, when a friend of mine had me listen to some lectures of his, so way back 6 years ago or so, it was about when the pronoun stuff was beginning to really take off. And I saw the problems he got, not for not using a pronoun that a person asked him to use, and that's important. But if someone wants me to, I'll do that. But no, but for standing up against the mandated use of pronouns by an institution and then by the government. And I agree with him. I think this is absolutely shocking, and we are in this because that is saying that it is the right of the state to dictate speech. And we know this is all wrapped up with all these other things and new kinds of laws now which exist, and which is also part and parcel of the new elite and the educated classes, and now what constitutes membership of the class, because by objecting to this, you're saying you're not good enough to be a member of that class, you're not good enough to have a position in certain institutions as a member of that class, and this has all sorts of implications. And this is all coming from the fact that it's like a snowball rolling, and it's of the time, and we can trace it back. All the stuff can be traced back to, generally I'd say the 1960s, but you can trace it back further. You could go even back to the 19th century. But certainly in the 1960s with feminism, and I don't want to just bang on about feminism, good, bad, what, but I'll just say this, where a big thing was made about language. And the argument was that the use of the word he to cover male and female, or man to cover male and female, that this was wrong, that man and he only ever referred to male. Now, one problem that was pointed out by this is gendered language. Gender is a grammatical feature of language. The gendered use of language is a grammatical feature of language. But the roles also within the classes are also part and parcel of the woof and warp of vocabulary. I understand why the feminists wanted to take on this issue, but I think it came with the consequences in which, now some people see this as good, I don't, in which the use of language is seen as a primary concern of the state and of legislation, of reason to sack people or appoint people. So it's taken on a degree of social importance. And my biggest objection to this is, one, I think it rather than making people smarter by attenuating them more to words and language, I think it's making people stupider because it makes them focus upon more trivial, and of course people scream about this, I don't care, trivial and incidental slights, as opposed to the very massive problems which have increased hugely since the 1970s, which I think is the possible death of Western civilization, which will come with mass slaughter. I'm talking about mass death. You're talking about people being hurt. This is the difference. And I think this is a class that, and an activity of a class, so a class has taken shape because of an activity that is monitor the use of language, install that within the legal code, and ultimately what you're doing is fracturing the society. So the symbiotic connections that are the tapestry of social relations are frayed. And this makes us completely vulnerable and completely bereft of any possible valuable future. It just won't. It's not going to last. So that's because, the heat, a certain action gets taken on board, and then over time it builds up. It's lived, and the group living ensconces the time develops, and things will turn into their opposite. Believe me, I have no doubt in my mind that the push towards total emancipation will end up in a dialectical antithesis in which there will be greater enslavement than, for so long it can't be, greater enslavement than even since antiquity. That's what I think. Okay. This brings me to the second point, some of which is kind of covered because I've talked about the build-up of time. So the time in when an action is taken. I think there's a very simple point to make, but it's one that people easily forget because they're so caught up in their sense of self-importance and desire to be heard, which is part of a kind of pathology of our particular age that's been happening for a little while. And I do think it's basically spoiled brat syndrome that goes right back to child rearing techniques of the 1960s. I know I sound like an old fart, but I just what can I say? Watching spoiled people throw tantrums is and seeing this on a mass degree with the student body now, they really look like 3-year-olds. Even more trivial and easily triggered and safe spaces, all this stuff. It's just these are not adults these are not people that are going to have any future. You can't have a future like that. The rest of the world just laughs at them. I think they're winning. They're laughable. They're already in the dustbin of history, and they're taking a lot of us with them. So the time an action is done, that's what I'm saying, this lot don't think about that. They just think, I don't like it, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. I'll rip down a statue. Actually, I think it's fair enough if people, they're say, we have decided that statue does not represent what the committee feels. If it's done in a certain way, but I would still say, look, I think historical statues, even the terrible people, are really interesting. It tells you about history. But let's look at a history in its complexity and look at the past in its complexity and recognise we're here because of them. Bloody hell. If Harvard was started by slave owners, then Harvard should still wear it, not take it down and pretend they weren't. This is to me, this is despicable. Yeah, that's about live time still, okay. But the time when the action is done, the people saying wanting to take down the statues there are able to do it because this is a time in which an action like that is seen as something good. If a member of a certain class, a member of aspiring for a certain profession, you can see it's very mimetic. All copying each other. We're all copying each other. This is where René Girard is very good about mimetic desire, because it's exactly that. So much of what is now considered to be virtuous is simply mimesis. It's simply us copying each other because the teachers told us this and we've copied each other and we've created this enclosed space which all action, by the way, is simply pathways of possibilities. And we now, or our elite, is trying to constrain and contain the various pathways of possibilities of upward mobility, of social prestige, even of employment. And what the choices of actions are, the choices of action is all to do with the kinds of times in which we live. I mentioned Jordan Peterson before. 40 years ago, had Jordan Peterson got up and given those lectures that he gives, he wouldn't have tens of millions of followers. He would be a guy that wrote a book on psychology. He probably wouldn't be in all the political stuff he's in anyway. And he would be considered, a good academic. But he wouldn't be there. He wouldn't be how he is now. Because that would not be, it wouldn't matter the way it does now. But when you get up now and you say, another example, 10 or so years ago, when Hillary Clinton said a marriage is between a man and a woman, period, some people didn't like it, but there wasn't outright hostility towards Hillary Clinton because she was speaking of that time. Now, it's very easy for people to speak in and of their time, and as the momentum changes, of course, politicians are going to change their mind, and I don't care about this particular issue. It's just an example of the way in which an issue in 1 year is like, and you respond to it one way, is one thing, and then later, it's like, we all learnt so much and everything. Well, it's different. Better in some ways, but some things are better. So let's say gay marriage. Now that I've touched on that, is the world better because of gay marriage? Well, in some ways, yes. For some people, yes. Other ways, maybe not. Some people, definitely not. It depends who you are. It depends what traditions you value. And then the bigger question is how is everything playing out into the greater world, much of which we don't really see? And again, this is taking me to somewhere I'm coming to later, is we'll only see it when it's really played out. So the fact that, come back to, I have a right to have something, or this is good for me. There's a very good book by a guy called David McClellan. I can't remember the title of it. And it was written, written a while back, like it's written 40 or 50 years ago. And he made the very interesting point that in Athens, when the society was so wealthy and they had slaves, it just seemed like everything was so good. But they ultimately, their dependency upon that, on slaves, made them more vulnerable. And 2 or 3 generations down the track, what had seemed like a boon was not. Oh, exactly the same kind of point at an existential level. This was in the paper today. Some guy had won, or maybe $200 million, some great big thing in the lottery, and then the stories about how he messed up his life. You know, we hear stories of this all the time. So, an action occurs. I'm moving around a bit here. I just want to say, any action, the time in which it is undertaking, is of central significance. And I think anyone wanting to make sense of what's going on around them should always ask that question. Was this action done in the time it was done? What does it mean given it was done in this time? That should be a question that you ask, that you can pause upon rather than to rush judgment. Pause upon that. And that, I think, will lead you to start meditating upon, reflecting upon the ways in, especially in our times of such, heat. You can see I get hot too, because it is time. We're in this time of social anger, all across the board. But one way we might think about it is to think is who's doing what and why they're doing it in the time that they're doing it, and what does that mean. Now, the other point I wanted to make, and in some ways, no, I'll just say the last thing on it. In some ways, I think the time when an action is done, I've mainly been speaking about it socially, but I'd say existentially, that's really, our existence is really, that's really something. And I'll relate it actually to, at our time, there's a huge push, and I wrote a piece on the Postal called Drag Queens versus Dragons. There's a huge push to bring in sexual stories to kids in libraries and in books and in Disney cartoons, and the people doing this are clearly doing it because it's a way of warding off. They say it's a way to stop prejudice. But most people I know who object to it they're not objecting to the fact that there's gay people or trans people. They don't care about that. Most people that I think about. What they're thinking is, it's not the time to introduce this stuff because they're kids. That is, the timing matters. And what I have noticed is the way in which the same kind of people that would, on the one hand, in a twinkle of an eye, get all upset about pedophilia, will, or something else, talk about age, because I noticed the moral censoriousness of our media. There's a story, a 50-year-old man is dating an 18-year-old girl, or someone who's past the age of consent has sex, and then goes, oh, but I really regret it, I was only 20 and he was 45 and now I feel I've lost everything, and there's a whole kind of industry of sympathy, and there's an expression, age appropriate. We just hear it in the air. It's one of those things that's in the air. But that can be said at one level, on one occasion, but there's this other thing where, oh, come on, why can't kids be reading about it? They're kids, they're interested in sex, they're 12, 13, 14, why shouldn't they? 8, 9? They should be. It's just a prejudice not to. And you would say, well, maybe the level of the conversation is actually, the way it used to be, is no. No kids were reading about that stuff. Not between boys and girls, or boys and boys, or girls and girls, or boys who want to be girls. No, because that was just seen as, we're not going to do that. And in some ways that was a collective decision based upon the prejudice, the habits and sentiments of the time. But that was a time in which the sexual identity of someone was not considered as central as now. But we can only talk about, well, then we'd have to talk about what does it mean sexual identity is the basis of a person and all that. That's another conversation. But in the first instance, just thinking about the timing in which it does helps us situate our assessment of things better by saying, well, okay, let's look across the ages and see what. And of course, when the sexual revolution occurred in the 60s and the lead up to that, there was a huge amount of talk about what was going on in other societies, about anthropology. Most of it was absolute bullshit, by the way. Most of it was just made up nonsense of the sort Margaret Mead engaged in. So it is a very natural thing for people to think about the time in which an action occurred, and then compare across the times. But as you do that, then you have to start thinking about the different social formations, the different contexts. You can't just go, because of then, now we can do this, because no, we live in a very different time. And all of this, all of this requires us just thinking comparatively about the associations we've got about the different ages and the different what is occurring in different ages and stages. And in this instance, of talking different ages of our own social development, of our own personal development. This is a child. We know that they, in medieval and Roman society, a child was just, until puberty they were a child. They were little people, but when they were puberty, that's it. They were like an adult. And we've sort of ring fenced this, and in some ways and it's all over the shop. And if we were just a bit more thoughtful about this, that might just be something helpful for us, instead of this, one set of demands upon another, this society of constant anger. Now, I said I wanted to talk about the time required to do an action. And the simple point I want to make here is that we in the West, ever since the 1960s, were a young generation thought it could change the world. It was, in many ways, was replicating the generation of the 1840s, where also a young generation, which included people like Karl Marx, but not only Karl Marx, also thought they could change the world. They were called the young Hegelians. Came out with all these prescriptions and, radical changes to society that they could be made. But the time required to change things is vast. It requires generations of work. Everything, I said we can see everything in terms of the lived ages. One thing I constantly think about when I think of institutional development or breakdown or events, my question always is, what's the generational arc? So if us, where we're at, the Gestalt switch goes back to the end of the Second World War, and then the birth of those, and the birth of those who would start reaching young adulthood in the 1960s, and that is a pivotal moment, because we see all these values coming into, as I said, some of them were anteceded in thought earlier, but now we see, and even played out in small ways, but played out on a much larger scale through the university, through a whole youth generation in the 1960s. Then they go into the institution. So we can see now it's been 2 to 3 generations. So that's, again, it's building up. It's an institutional build-up. As narratives form, expectations form, change of priority shifts. But the time required to make change. Now, when I said time required to do an action, this applies to everything. It's guitar, the time required to learn a guitar, the time required to learn a language. We want to eliminate time in many ways. Karl Marx said a very good thing about capitalism. He said capitalism is a process, amongst other things, but which is constantly accelerating time. We're dividing it into ever small, so it's, in a sense, everything is speeding up. All that's solid melts to air is a great phrase, famous phrase of his. And we are constantly shortening the spaces between things. And we're also constantly shortening the time. We constantly want to take less time to do things. So now, we've got a language translator. Immediately we get we don't have, of course there's something lost with that. We don't have the expertise. We can't be sure if we're using a language translator it's right. We may not be sure it's the best translation. It may not be. Some of these things are pretty sophisticated. But we forget there was an enormous amount of time that was taken to build up the machinery then that destroys time, in a sense or that overcomes time. Now, when it comes to doings of I want to say a mechanical sort, but just a functional sort. When it comes to performing certain functions, the acceleration or the, indeed, obliteration of time can be very, very helpful. I'm in Japan and I want to say something to someone, I don't know how to. I've got this Google, I speak into it and it comes out in the other language. Yeah, that's fantastic. And, the greatness of the modern world largely consists in labour-saving devices, which was exactly what Descartes hoped would happen with the great mechanical revolution. It was meant to create machinery that would alleviate the burdens of labour, and of course that's exactly what washing machines and all these things do. And now we can store information, get it instantly, communicate, so there's this fantastic. But on the other hand, yes, and the danger is that this can, because these kind of functions can be achieved by a great deal of knowledge, which when instantiated into technologies and techniques, sure, incredible, just changes the nature of everything. But there's other things we do which aren't like that at all. That they're simply not like that. And so we are easily beguiled into thinking that everything can be done timelessly. No, time. I mentioned, the time taken for a child to mature. One of the reasons why child abuse is so shocking is because it's to be an adult and to be beaten up is one thing, but to be a child and to be beaten up is another thing. And to be a child and be abused in whatever way or sexually, it's the resources that one has at that moment are so vulnerable, you're so fragile, that the long-term effects and the difficulty of working through it is so much greater. Now, I don't, everybody. I don't want to speak in such a way that I'm saying that no one can ever get over anything if they're young, or I don't want to say that. But I am saying that one thing that an education was always about, traditionally, forever, and even education in tribal societies that doesn't involve sitting down with reading books or anything, but inducting people into societies, is recognising the different powers of the different stages of life. This has been one of the sad things about modernity, is it's tended to make, I think Baudrillard is very good on this. I don't often quote the postmodernists in a positive light, but I will quote him on this. I think we can call him a postmodernist. It's not that machines are becoming more like humans, but we're becoming more like machines. He had that insight, and I think that's true. And that is a terrible thing. That's a really dangerous. Does us no good. Well, you can think about why that is the case. I don't need to tell you why. I hope I don't need to say why. So anyway, as we go through a life and the different stages, to be aware of these stages, to realise the time that is taken, the ambition. So we don't live forever. Now, transposing that in our own life, we know that, I'm not going to sit down and learn Chinese. Now, I'm not saying that someone shouldn't at my age, but I'm not going to do it because I've got all these other things to do. And I think in a life, people make decisions because they're smart enough to know that anything they're going to do now will take time to do it. So you make your choices. But when it comes to social things, increasingly what has occurred, I think it's got to do with the fact that the norms that have been so directive of emancipation came out of the generation who were very young, and being young, I think they were very conceited and thought they would live forever and thought eternity was in their grasp and whatever they say had eternal value. I think this is always the folly of all generations of youth. I'm reminded, and I'm saying this, it's such an old fart, but I'm reminded of this letter I saw written by an Assyrian back in about 700 BC, something like that. It might have even been earlier, in which he's complaining about the younger generation. But I'm really complaining about my generation when it was younger, so it's not just this younger generation, because I think it failed to take into account time. And the worst thing it did was when it stormed the universities, it demanded that the curricula be changed to suit its interests. And this has had shocking consequences. And as someone who's been in love with learning my entire life and knows how little I know, I've just found it astonishing how incredibly more stupid stuff coming out of universities is, especially in the humanities. And it goes back to then. It goes back to a group of people who hadn't lived thinking that they should dictate what should be on the curriculum. That's crazy. And that was a defiance of time. A defiance of time. Finally, the time taken required to see the significance of something. I'll be very brief because this has been much longer than I thought it would be. And I'll just say this. Life is a constant process of revelation. And it is revealing things that we never see the complete consequences of our action when we do them. And the idea that we ever could see the complete consequences of our action when we do them is insane, and it tends to be a kind of philosophical conceit that I think is wrong, with a primary emphasis upon ethics within the philosophical tradition. I will speak about evil because I think that when we speak about that, I'll be able to elaborate further. I know I've touched upon this earlier, but the point I want to make is that when we act, we do not know the repercussions of an action. And sometimes we may never see the repercussions of an action. Another time, it may take us 30 or 40 years or 50 years to see what something meant. And in fact, we do not know how the full meaning of anything that has significance until we've been made aware of its significance. And very often, an act, the deed, may incubate. The significance of something may be lying in waiting, incubating. It's like it didn't happen. It's like, someone's murdered someone and they think they've got away with it. And then 30 years later, I don't know, a dog comes along and digs up a bone. And then there's a DNA test, and then that person. That's a pretty easy kind of case to make my point. When it comes to society and political philosophy and social philosophy, there we can see that people are acting all the time so sure that they have got it right. Neville Chamberlain is usually treated, and possibly he should be criticised. Not possibly, he got it wrong. But he goes to Hitler and he's trying to convince Hitler. It's a kind of textbook case, and everybody knows this. So he's used as a standard example of appeasement. And he believed Hitler. What people barely mention, though, is that at that time, the force of events, the power, the culmination of events had been such that there were two things that pressured upon him that led him to make this judgment. One was he didn't want a repeat of the First World War. Two was what was going on with the Soviets, and he certainly didn't want anything that would enable the Soviets. And if that meant doing a deal with Hitler, that meant doing a deal with Hitler. And no matter what you think about Hitler, the Soviets, they get too good a rap. They were murdering swine, as was Hitler, but they were too. So all I'm saying is now, but he made the wrong call. And we knew everyone knew he made the wrong call. Everybody knew it a couple of years later. Or however, I can't remember when he meets with Hitler and comes back, what's that, 35 or something. Forgive me if I'm a bit fuzzy on that date. But anyway, but when war is declared against Germany, with Germany invading Poland, it seems like, this Chamberlain was just an idiot. He shouldn't have done that. Or he was fooled, he was duped. So often, too, you read stuff about the French and Russian Revolution, you read about the wrong timing of, Louis being ineffective or Tsar Nicola being ineffective. And this is all, we can see it now, but they couldn't see it then. And this is the point. In the world, you can't see it. We're acting blindly. And the reason that we want to think a bit better is because we are acting blindly. And nothing will solve all our problems. And if anyone comes to you with total conviction about what should be done, don't trust them. It's easier to see what shouldn't be done. I think you can do that. I think you can see, because the evidence starts mounting, and you go, well, do I really want to be a part of that? Do I really want to accept that? Do I really want to go along with that? That, I think, is a good way to analyse and assess things, but recalling all the time that the full meaning of something will take time to be seen. I think the more thoughtful people are those who quickly identify something that most people think is just not that important. And they think, hang on, this is really symptomatic of some deeper social rupture. And if we don't attend to this now, this is really going to be disastrous for us. Thank you very much. I think that's more than enough for this talk.